Good. Okay. Well, let's move on to this next caller. Caller, welcome to the show. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Yeah, hi, gentlemen. This is Roger from Philadelphia.
Welcome, Roger.
How you guys doing?
Doing great. How are you today? What's the
I'm
question
doing
for
pretty
Rabbi?
good. So, all right, so I got kind of an interesting question here. Okay, so if you read in the Christian Bible, like around the time that, Jesus was, arrested and all that, his followers were, I guess, lack of a better word, very cowardly.
Right.
But then, after the supposed resurrection and then him seeing all of them, these men were willing to go to their deaths, right? And some in very horrible ways, but they still said, we believe in this guy, So
Sure.
I guess my question is, how do you explain why, like, if it was all, like, based on a lie and all that, you know what I mean?
Can I keep this question on, and Roger, I just want to ask you a question. Could you give me an example of a disciple that gave his life for what he believed in the Christian Bible?
All right. Let's say, let's see, who was it? Who was the one who was crucified upside down?
That would be Peter, I think, or is it either Peter or
Let him work this out.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
Go ahead, Roger. Tell me. Give me a single example in the Christian Bible that a disciple died willingly and was martyred for what he believed. That Jesus rose from the dead, for example. Could you give me a single example?
A simple example?
Yeah, because that's the whole point of your question.
Right.
Take your time.
Sorry, I was trying to think. Let's see. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of an example. How, Peter, like, he was crucified upside down and...
Where, in what verse and what chapter in the Christian Bible does it say that Peter was crucified upside down? Where is this in the Christian Bible?
Exactly.
So let me help you out here, Roger. There's a reason why you don't know where it is, and it's not because you're not familiar with the Christian Bible. It's because they don't exist. There is no example in the Christian Bible where a disciple died for what he believed. All of these stories, for example, that Peter was executed by Nero in Rome and asked to be executed upside down, because after all, he didn't deserve to die the way Jesus did, is pure stories that were made up much, much later and are found nowhere in the Christian Bible. And as you can well imagine, if Peter had be willing to die for what he believed, which he never would have, you could be sure if he did, it would be all over the place. You could be sure the book of Acts was written when? 85, 80, 85, 90? I mean, now, are we to believe that the book of Acts, that Paul willingly died in Rome, and the book of Acts just thought, no, that's not important enough to mention? Does anybody believe that? That Paul died willingly for his faith? And the book of Acts, which is essentially, although it's the book of the Acts of the Apostles, and it's really about Paul. The book of Acts is really a story about Paul and his development, right? And his preeminence. How does the book of Acts end? Paul is freed from prison, freed from jail. There's nothing in the book of Acts about him being executed. Do you think the author of the book of Acts would have let that one go? And we find John, the son of Zebedee's brother, he dies in the book of Acts, but he's not martyred. He doesn't die for his faith. He's killed. So we find no martyrdom of disciples in the Christian Bible, and therefore it is extremely likely that Paul was not executed. That would be very unlikely, and for the reasons you mentioned. Why would you die for what you know isn't true? And probably Paul died in Spain because that's where the end of Romans, which is the last of his writings, or those writings of Paul that are indisputed, where Paul indicates that he was going to spend his ministry, was going to move on, and then he disappears. So Paul probably died in Spain. The stories later that everybody is martyred, everybody, they're dying, they're being thrown into fires, they're being chopped up, Paul's head's chopped off, it bounces 3 times, and you can go. If you're not sure, you can get on the United Airlines flight, and you can fly to Rome, and you can go to visit the church where this all occurred. Now, why was Nero ultimately the one who takes the flak and is the one who the church will claim killed the disciples, executed them? It's because we have in the 2nd century, we have Tacitus, a very important Roman historian, who says that Nero, burning Rome down, he wanted to blame it on someone, and he blamed it on Christians and then publicly executed Christians. But Tacitus doesn't say that Paul or Peter. This is later stories that are developed in the Catholic Church that are all part of the fantasy of the Catholic Church. There's absolutely nothing to support it. But Nero does take the heat because Nero is convenient because of Tacitus. I mean, do you realize, does anyone in their right mind really believe that Peter asked to be crucified upside down and just somebody in the Christian Bible went, yeah, no, that's not important enough? Would definitely have made it in. That would have been the headlines because they would have wanted to show precisely what you've stated, that disciples are willing to die for what they believe in, and liars don't make very good martyrs. People are not willing to die for a lie. The only disciple about whom the church says did not die a martyr's death was John, the son of Zebedee, who, according to Christian tradition, is the author of the book of John and Revelation. But we know that the book of John is the last, chronologically, the last of the 4 Gospels. It would likely have been written, let's say, 90, which means if you are to believe. Now, the book of John does not claim to be written by John. That's a later Christian tradition. And in fact, at the end of John, the author is actually almost explicitly says that he's not John because he says that he got it from John. But the point is that if you are to believe that the 21 chapters in the book of John were written by a disciple of Jesus, meaning when Jesus was alive, he was already an adult, he was 20, 30 years old, and he was still alive in the year 90, that means he had to be a man who died practically 100 years old. So Christian tradition doesn't want John just to die an old man, so there's all kinds of stories that he was thrown into frying oil, and he walked away from it and so on. But ultimately, every attempt on John's life was unsuccessful. And then John dies a very old man, which they would have to. But he would have to in order to have written the book of John, in order to have written the book of Revelation. Now, you might ask me about the book of Revelation. The author of the book of Revelation does identify himself as John. But he doesn't say which John he is. He doesn't say he's John, the son of Zebedee. That's also going to be a Christian tradition. It's going to be, the church fathers are going to disagree over whether Revelation should even be included in the canon. And the question hinged on whether it was authored by the disciple John. Ultimately, those who believe it should be included, obviously it's one of the 27 books of the Christian Bible. So the answer to this question is that Christians struggle with the fact of with differentiating between what's in the Christian Bible and what is Roman Catholic folklore. And I'm not talking about Roman Catholics, because Roman Catholics know and recognize rightfully that so much of what they believe is part of Catholic tradition. But as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, the teachings of the patristic teachings, the teachings of the Church Father, had the weight of Scripture to them. But Protestants, that's the big question. What are Lutherans, what are Baptists doing accepting, embracing Roman Catholic traditions? And this is an example where, you called in, and I didn't mean to push you on this, asking you where does it say it. I wanted to bring out a point. And that is that these stories are so moving, they are so well developed, and they are. They're very, here, Peter, I don't deserve to be crucified like Jesus. Well, crucified like Jesus, hundreds of thousands of Jews were executed like Jesus with this horrible crucifixion. But I want to be crucified upside down. Oh, wow, the passion. That he was so humble, and he was granted that indignity, and he's buried in Rome. So the answer to the question is these stories are invented, they're nonsense. Every as far as Christian tradition goes, almost everybody's killed. Everybody's killed. There is a martyr in the book of Acts, namely Stephen, Acts 6 and 7. But Stephen wasn't a disciple. That means Stephen, if we are to believe that story occurred. Now, Stephen dies in a way that's remarkably like Jesus, particularly in the book of Luke, and we would expect that, given that the author of Luke, whoever wrote the book, is also the author of the book of Acts. But Stephen is not a disciple, meaning Stephen doesn't know Jesus. Stephen if we are to just accept what the book of Acts tells us, that Stephen was an early Christian who was willing to die for his religion, he was not a Christian who encountered Jesus. He was a Christian who simply believed what Christians had told him. He was just an early convert to the Christian religion. So he's not a disciple. So the fact that non-disciples would die for their religion, that you find in every religion. You'll find in every religion, there isn't a religion in the world that there are Tibetan Buddhists that light themselves on fire. There are people in all religions that are willing to die for what they firmly believe. Mormons gave their lives for what they believed. They gave their lives, and I have no doubt that many of them absolutely believe and were willing to die for what they believe. Of course they did. And Jews gave their lives not to accept the Christian religion throughout the Crusade. This is a story that never ended. So we're not talking about, just want to make this clear, I'm not talking about Stephen, I'm not talking about later Christians, Ignatius. I happen to believe his letters are nonsensical. He never wrote them. It's inconceivable to me that he would wrote stuff like that on his way to being executed. But let's just say Ignatius never met Jesus, so he's just a Christian and the earliest church father in the early 2nd century. So the question is disciples. Now, your question is heightened, Roger, by the fact that we find something very striking in the Christian Bible. For example, Matthew 28:17, when the disciples go to the Galilee to encounter Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, it says they saw him and worshipped him, but some doubted it. Some didn't believe it. That's astonishing. Now, the question is, how did that ever get into the Christian Bible? Now, think about this for a moment. How likely is it that no disciple doubted that Jesus rose from the dead, but yet an author of the Christian Bible would have invented that? I wanted you to think about this for a moment. It is understandable why Christians would invent the stories that Christians were willing to die for their religion. That means it would certainly advance the cause of Christianity. It would warm the hearts of believers and unbelievers who might then convert, given what the question you asked. But why would we find question in the Christian Bible as to whether this even occurred? that any disciple would have questioned. How could you question the resurrection? If the resurrection happened the way it's in the movies, the way it's taught in Sunday school, who would doubt that? And who would make that up? So this fulfills what is the most rigorous criteria for knowing whether a text or anything we're told in the Christian Bible is actually historical. That means that although I'm not a Christian, I don't believe the Christian Bible is a historical book. It doesn't mean there is nothing in the Christian Bible that is historical. I don't mean like Herod the Great. Of course there was a person named Herod the Great. I don't mean that. That you'll find in a Connecticut King Arthur's court. I mean that if there is something in the Christian Bible that's unflattering about disciples, it's likely to be true that no one would have done such a thing. If Paul and Peter had a confrontation, as we're told in the book of Galatians, where Paul confronted Peter to his face, how likely is it that Paul would have invented that? Now, it's very likely that Paul and Peter were at each other's throats. It's too embarrassing. Likewise, it would be very embarrassing to concede that there was doubt. The authors of the Christian Bible, no doubt, knew that there was a lot of talk going down, that people were saying, I didn't see any of this, I didn't hear any of this, and I don't believe this. And they therefore had to load that into the text to sort of explain that away. There could be very little doubt. There could be very little doubt that there would be no reason to include in the Christian Bible Matthew 16 texts like no disciple of it knew who Jesus was and what he was doing until the very end. Why would you make that up? So getting back to your point, Roger, as it turns out, these stories of the disciples willing to die for what they believe is a later Christian invention and therefore is not included in the Christian Bible. There is no reason to believe that the author of the book of Acts, whose job it was, who was dedicated to elevating Paul to preeminence, that his Christology would be the one that would win out over the Jerusalem church, that if he had given his life for what he believed, it's inconceivable that the book of Acts wouldn't consider that important enough to include. But it doesn't. It is much more, what is much more likely is that Paul probably died somewhere in Spain of whatever. So the answer is it isn't there. But I hope you can grasp from this of how people with good intentions just presuppose, they sort of conflate together Roman Catholic tradition with the Christian Bible. It just isn't there. And Christians so frequently go, why would all the disciples willing to die for their belief? The answer, they didn't. And that's why it's not in the Christian Bible. And that's why it's part of Christian lore later on. So that's the answer to your question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא עת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה